Should transgender athletes compete in women's sports? It's definitely a question that sparks a lot of debate, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. It's become a real flashpoint, hasn't it? Globally, people are trying to figure out how you balance inclusivity, which is so important, with, well, what most people think of as fairness in sports.
Right. And today on the deep dive, we're trying to get straight to the heart of it. The core question seems to be, does allowing transgender women, that is, biological males, into women's sports, does it fundamentally undermine things? Does it create an uneven playing field for cisgender women?
Yeah, that's the crux of it. We'll be looking at the biology, the ethics, the actual impact on competition based on the research and data we've been able to pull together.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this. It's complex.
It is, and that central tension jumps out immediately, You've
Yeah.
got inclusion, you've got fairness, both really important values, but here they often seem to clash. And the material we've reviewed, it tends to strongly emphasize biological sex as, well, the key factor in athletic competition. The argument is that the physical differences between biological males and females, strength, speed, endurance, they're just really significant in sports.
Absolutely. And our sources really dig into those biological realities with some, well, pretty compelling data.
Yeah.
We start with that basic point. Biological males generally have advantages: more muscle mass, denser bones, higher testosterone,
Yeah.
all contributing to more power, faster recovery.
And this is where it gets tricky, isn't it? Because what about hormone therapy?
Exactly. That's the million-dollar question. A 2020 study in sports medicine found something pretty critical. Even after 2 whole years of hormone therapy, trans women still held on to a noticeable strength advantage, somewhere between 5 and 9% compared to cisgender women. The source called that a critical point.
And that 5 to 9%, it might not sound like a massive number to everyone, but in elite sports,
Yeah.
wow.
It's huge.
It can absolutely be the difference between winning and losing consistently. Then there's that 2019 analysis from World Athletics, looking specifically at sprint events.
Yeah, I saw that one.
Their findings showed that biological males, even after hormone therapy, were still, on average, 10 to 12% faster than elite female athletes.
10 to 12% faster.
Yeah. And as the source points out, that kind of gap, well, that's easily the difference between getting a gold medal and maybe not even making the finals.
Right, so these aren't just tiny, negligible differences we're talking about. They can genuinely change outcomes. And it looks even starker in strength-focused sports.
Definitely. That 2021 study in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, that one found trans women kept a 20 to 30% advantage in lifting capacity,
20 to 30%.
even after 3 years of suppressing testosterone. Those are, well, pretty substantial numbers.
Yeah, they really are. And to kind of put a face to these numbers, the source brings up the case of Leah Thomas, the swimmer.
Right, Leah Thomas. Her case really became a major focal point, didn't it? And when you look at the actual performance data, it's quite striking.
How so?
Well, before transitioning, competing on the men's team at Penn, her national ranking wasn't even in the top 400.
Okay.
But after transitioning, competing against women, the source details how she started breaking records, winning consistently, and then, of course, winning the NCAA 500-yard freestyle title in 2022.
That's a huge shift in results. And the source quotes Olympian Nancy Hogshead Makar, making the argument that those biological advantages from male puberty, wider shoulders, bigger lungs, more muscle mass developed over years with higher testosterone, she argues they just aren't fully erased by hormone therapy.
Which raises that really difficult question about fairness for the cisgender swimmers, right? The ones who've trained their whole lives.
Exactly. And there was that quote, that anonymous quote from a teammate in the New York Times. Did you see that?
I did. It feels like we're being erased from our own sport.
Yeah. That really hits home, doesn't it? It brings in the human side, the emotional side of this whole debate.
That feeling of being erased, it really pushes us towards that core ethical question our source tackles. Okay, we acknowledge sports are important for identity, community, self-esteem. Some even argue participation is a basic human right. But the counter-argument immediately comes up. When fairness in the actual competition is potentially compromised, whose rights should take priority?
And that leads straight into the history of women's sports, which is, well, it's crucial context here.
Absolutely. The source reminds us women's sports categories were set up in the first place because biological females couldn't compete on a level playing field with biological males. It was about creating opportunity where it didn't exist.
It brings up Title IX in the U.S. from '72. That landmark law aimed at ensuring women had equal athletic opportunities.
Right. And the argument presented in the source is that allowing biological males into women's categories risks undoing decades of progress. It potentially dismantles the very protections Title IX was meant to build.
So the focus shifts, according to this perspective, to prioritizing what the source calls the collective rights of cisgender female athletes who, have historically faced systemic disadvantages in sports anyway.
And to kind of complicate things further, or at least show the nuances around fairness and biology, the source brings up Castor Semenya.
Ah, yes. Important to clarify here, though, right? Semenya is a cisgender woman.
Exactly. A cisgender woman with naturally high testosterone because of difference in sex development, a DSD. She's not transgender. But crucially, she faced testing and was required to lower her testosterone levels to compete in women's events.
Right. And the source uses her case to argue for consistency. The logic goes. Right. If even cisgender women with naturally higher testosterone face restrictions to ensure fair competition.
Then it seems logical from that viewpoint that transgender women who went through male puberty with all its hormonal advantages should also be considered within a similar framework for fairness.
The source puts it pretty bluntly. Consistency demands that biological sex, not gender identity, be the determining factor if the main goal is a level playing field in women's sports.
Now, there's a common counterargument you hear that the science isn't really settled yet, or that hormone therapy basically levels the playing field anyway.
Yeah, you do hear that.
Our source calls that a misleading assertion. It points to a big 2023 meta-analysis in Frontiers in Physiology. They looked at 15 different studies.
Okay, what did they find?
Well, what's really notable is they found transgender women kept significant advantages: muscle strength, bone density, aerobic capacity, even after 5 years of hormone therapy.
5 years is a long time. That seems significant.
It does, and the source quotes the researchers directly. They concluded, "Current protocols for transgender athlete eligibility may not adequately address performance disparities."
So the science is actually casting doubt on the current rules.
That's what this meta-analysis suggests, yeah.
Yeah.
Which naturally leads to questions about other potential solutions, right? Like, could weight classes work? Or
Yeah.
handicapping?
The source touches on that. It says weight classes might work for, say, wrestling or boxing, where weight is already central.
But much harder for basketball, soccer, track, where it's about overall athleticism, not just size or weight in the same way.
And handicapping systems, like based on hormone levels or something.
The source suggests that would get really complicated, really subjective. It could undermine the whole point of objective competition. Imagine trying to calculate a fair handicap for a 100-meter dash with some formula. It just seems messy and, frankly, impractical.
Yeah, hard to picture how that would work fairly for anyone. And look, beyond the stats and the rules, the source also makes a really important point about the emotional side for cisgender women athletes. Their experiences sometimes get lost in this debate.
That sense of futility and injustice they might feel, right? Competing against what they perceive as inherent biological advantages that training just can't overcome.
Exactly. There was a 2022 survey by the Women's Sports Foundation mentioned.
Yeah, I saw that. Found that 68%, pretty big majority of female college athletes, felt demoralized or discouraged competing against transgender women, specifically because they felt it was unfair.
And the source stresses this feeling isn't necessarily about transphobia, but about their perception of the biological reality they're facing on the track or the field.
Which ties back to that Connecticut high school track example from 2017-2019.
Right. 2 transgender girls had a lot of success. 15 state titles, records broken. But the source focuses on the cisgender runners, like Selena Sol.
And the opportunities they felt they lost out on. Scholarships, recognition.
Yeah. Sol's quote to Fox News was quite telling. "I fully support transgender rights, but I also believe in fairness. We're losing chances we've worked our whole lives for." The source calls it a painful truth that sometimes trying to be inclusive in this way can end up marginalizing the very group women's sports were set up to support.
And the implications go beyond just individual races or games. The source raises a bigger concern. Could this whole issue actually threaten the long-term viability of female athletics as a whole?
How so? It looks at specific examples, right? Like Laurel Hubbard, the weightlifter.
Exactly. Laurel Hubbard from New Zealand, competing at the Tokyo Olympics in 2020, competed as male until age 35. qualified for the women's team under the IOC hormone rules at the time.
And while she didn't end up winning, she finished last, actually.
Right, but the key point the source makes is that her participation meant a cisgender female weightlifter who would have otherwise qualified didn't get to go to the Olympics.
So it becomes about allocation of limited spots, too.
Precisely. And it fueled criticism that the IOC's rule then, 12 months of testosterone suppression below a certain level, was maybe too lenient. That it didn't account for the cumulative effects, the lasting impact of going through male puberty.
Then there's the Fallon-Fox case in MMA. That one brings up different concerns.
Yeah, that shifts more towards safety, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Fallon-Fox, a biological male who transitioned competing against women in a combat sport.
The source highlights what happened with her opponent, Tamika Brents, in 2014.
Right. Brent said she felt overwhelmed by Fox's strength in a way she never had before. She ended up with a concussion, a fractured orbital bone.
Wow.
And her quote is powerful. "I fought a lot of women and have never felt the strength I felt in a fight as I did that night." It really pushes back against the idea that hormone therapy negates all physical advantages, especially in sports where physical force is so direct.
So all these examples, the data, the personal stories, they lead us right into this policy dilemma that sports organizations are wrestling with.
Exactly. How do you balance inclusion with, well, competitive integrity and safety? It's a tough balancing act.
We see current policies trying, right?
Yep.
The IOC, World Athletics, they often use these testosterone thresholds, like under 10 nanomoles per liter for 12 months. That's a common one.
It is. But the source argues those thresholds are kind of arbitrary. There isn't definitive proof they actually eliminate the advantages from male puberty.
Is there evidence they don't?
Well, it cites a 2022 study in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. That study found even when trans women got their testosterone down to that 10 nmol level, their performance metrics still looked more like biological males than biological females.
So the current international standards might not be achieving that level playing field.
That's the question the study raises, yeah. And it might explain why some sports are taking a harder line.
Like rugby and boxing.
Right. The source mentions they've effectively banned transgender women from the women's categories, citing safety risks. World Rugby's 2020 policy specifically mentioned an unacceptable risk of injury, based on data showing significantly greater tackling force even after hormone therapy.
So those sports are prioritizing safety and maybe perceive fairness over inclusion in the women's category?
It seems that way. The source suggests it reflects a growing recognition that maybe fairness and safety can't be sacrificed on the altar of inclusion, as they put it.
Which brings us to the wider context, doesn't it? This isn't just happening in a sports bubble.
Not at all. It's tied up in much broader cultural and political currents. Advocacy for transgender rights has gained a lot of ground, and for many, sports inclusion has become a kind of litmus test for societal acceptance.
And the source notes that this can make conversations difficult, right? If people who raise concerns about fairness are immediately labeled.
Yeah, it can lead to polarization, making nuanced conversations really hard. But the source tries to be clear. The argument it's presenting is about preserving a level playing field for biological females, not about denying anyone's identity or humanity.
That's a critical distinction.
It is. The source argues there's sometimes a conflation mixing up sports policy, which is about rules for competition, with broader civil rights issues. It makes the point that athletics operates on a meritocratic basis, based on performance.
It quotes Dr. Carole Hooven, the feminist scholar.
Right, from her book on testosterone. Acknowledging biological differences doesn't mean denying someone's identity. It means ensuring that competition remains fair and meaningful.
Okay, so if full inclusion in the women's category raises all these issues according to the source, what are the alternatives? What's the path forward?
Well, the source brings up the idea of separate categories or open divisions.
An open division, what would that look like?
The concept is basically a category where anyone can compete, any gender identity, any biological sex. So transgender athletes could participate, but it wouldn't directly impact the protected women's category.
Are there examples of this?
The source mentions the New York City Marathon having a non-binary division, which is maybe a step in that direction, at least for non-elite participation.
But that doesn't sound like a perfect solution either. What are the downsides?
Well, the source acknowledges them. Could it lead to stigmatization? Would there be enough competition, especially in smaller sports? And realistically, in an open division, trans women might still be at a disadvantage against biological males.
So it's complicated.
It is. But ultimately, the source keeps coming back to its main principle. The priority should be preserving women's sports as a space where biological females can excel.
Okay, so wrapping this up, the core argument we've explored from our source material is pretty clear. Biological males generally keep significant physical advantages even after hormone therapy, and this impacts fairness and sometimes safety in women's sports.
Right. And the discussion, as presented here, is framed around protecting the integrity of female athletics, recognizing that long history of women fighting for their place in sports rather than being about denying anyone's identity.